Hello and welcome to the Imprint Weekly Podcast. I'm John Kelly, Senior Editor of the Imprint, a daily news site covering child welfare and youth justice around the country. You can read all of our coverage at imprintnews.org or check us out on Facebook or Twitter at the Imprint News. You can sign up on our homepage for our free weekly and monthly newsletters, and for professionals in child welfare and youth justice, subscribe to our Youth Services Insider section for a closer look at news on business policy and practice. The Imprint Weekly Podcast is also a member of the SafeCamp Audio Network. You can check out our show page and all of SafeCamp's other great podcasts at safecampaudio.org on the web, at SafeCampAudio on social media. On this week's podcast, we are joined by Anthony Pierro, Executive Director of Strategies for Youth, which is a national policy and training organization dedicated to improving interactions between law enforcement and youth. Pierro took the helm at Strategies for Youth last year from its founder, Lisa Thurau, who has been on this podcast before, and inherits an organization that 2 years ago produced a list of 12 model policies for police to adopt when it comes to youth. So we talked about Pierro's career as a juvenile prosecutor and how that informed his approach to training law enforcement, his time on a Trump administration Justice Commission that got fairly obscured by the COVID pandemic, his strategy for proliferating the 12 model policies, and a new app that the organization is developing for police departments. So without further ado, here's our conversation with Anthony Pierro. We are joined today by Anthony Pierro, the relatively new Executive Director of Strategies for Youth, which is a national policy and training organization dedicated to improving interactions between law enforcement and youth. Really, they're the only national organization focused on that. Anthony, thank you for joining us on the Imprint Weekly Podcast.
Thank you for having me. I really appreciate being here.
Anthony, I think, is the third person from Strategies for Youth to join us on this podcast. I know that we have had Lisa at least one time, Lisa Thurau, who he is succeeding in this role, and Shelley Jackson one time to talk about the model policies for that interaction between youth and law enforcement. We'll talk about a little bit later as well. But before we move on with the conversation, let's get these guys to know you a little bit. Anthony, You got to give me at least one pick from these pop culture categories. Just giving me a favorite. You can give me all of them if you want. Movie or TV show, musical group, book or sports team. Movie, TV, musical group, book, or sports team. What do you got?
Let's go movie, TV.
Okay.
I'm a movie guy.
Okay. What do you got? What's your favorite movie of all time? Or you can just recommend something really good that you've seen recently.
Wow, my favorite movie of all time. So I'm going to go with Braveheart, Gladiator. That's kind of where I live in those types of movies. I love those movies. I'm trying to think of some other big Top Gun fan. Love Top Gun. I heard there's a third one coming out. I'll look forward to that. But if I had to dial in, I'm going to say Braveheart.
All right. Braveheart it is. A lot of man in the arena stuff there.
Yes, absolutely.
Out of Anthony. Okay. So you spent 20 years or more, a little more than 2 decades, as Chief Juvenile Attorney for Toms River, New Jersey, which for people that don't know what that is, not far from New York City. I'm going to say I would equate it with Jersey Shore. Is it not the TV show, the region? It's definitely part of the Jersey Shore.
It is.
Yeah. What's the job entail? What would a month of cases parse out like in that job? What are you doing over a course of 30 days in that role?
Yeah, what a great question. We handled everything. I was drawn to juvenile court for a number of reasons, which we could talk about. But Ocean County, so Toms River is in Ocean County, which actually is where Jersey Shore is filmed. That's in Seaside Heights.
Really?
Which is right over the border there. There's a bridge that goes to Seaside Heights. So it's technically probably the town over. And we saw everything. So the population would depend on the summer, right? In the summer, you had a lot of people come into Ocean County. It is the Jersey Shore. So our population would swell. And then in the winter, it would shrink back down. But we were still one of the most populated counties in the state. And we saw everything. We were exposed to every type of incident that you could imagine. And I think it helped me as a prosecutor because you're able to see what is actually happening in your community. You just get a really good sense of what's impacting young people, what they're seeing, what's going on in the community. And again, we handled everything because we had your typical Jersey Shore silly things that would happen. And then unfortunately, we handled cases up to and including homicides.
What's the stupidest thing you saw a kid do and get arrested for in those
Oh
20
my
years?
God.
Does anything
Oh my
jump
God.
out?
No, I mean, kids do all sorts of crazy things. I've seen a lot of stupid things. What we tried to do is make sure they weren't charged for it towards the end. And that was part of my job, is to make sure that, which was because I had a case, and I guess it's an answer to this, where I opened the case file and I thought to myself, there's no way that the community would want me handling this, right? I'm a prosecutor. I went to law school, where you want me out there protecting the community, handling some serious things that are going on. And that was the case of a 10-year-old who was chasing around a 9-year-old to try to give her a kiss. That was the case that was presented to me. And I thought, there's other ways to handle this, right? We don't need a prosecutor to be addressing this. We can handle this in a different way.
I guess that's what I was getting at and asking a question is part is like most of your approach as a lead attorney on this stuff must be to some extent parsing out, okay, these don't need to even be here at all.
Yeah.
This is something we could probably quickly dispense of with the right referral as long as the kid is willing to admit that he did it or she did it. Then of a smaller slice of are saying they're innocent, it's a serious thing, and we're going to actually move forward to trying to prove it in court and things like that. Is that about right? Or is there another part of the continuum I'm missing entirely there?
No, it's 100% right. And what I tried to do in the role was train law enforcement. We did a lot of law enforcement training, which of course ends up leading me to strategies. But I wanted to make sure that the law enforcement community in Ocean County understood all the things that we just talked about. Oftentimes, decisions that we make are based upon the options that we think we have. So I wanted to make sure that law enforcement knew what programs exist. So if you respond to a home and there's a family dynamic that you know needs to be addressed, and maybe charging that person isn't the right answer, because what outcome of that is going to end up positive? We want to make sure that we have those systems in place, that you can make those referrals, that you can be confident that those services are going to work, engage, and do the right thing. And I think I wanted to make sure that law enforcement was trained. Second to that, though, I built exactly what you said. In Ocean County, what I did was I read every single filing. So anytime a juvenile was charged, that case would come to me and I would read every one of them. And I took the time to read every single one of them, to go through to say, okay, does this need to be here? What box do I want to put this in? Meaning, is this a case that we can divert and know that a diversion program is the better outcome? Or is this a case that needs to go in front of a judge and needs to be handled because it's a little bit more serious, or there's something else about that case that's jumping out? I found that to be one of the most important things that I did, was put myself right in the middle of that. A lot of that, again, gets to you because maybe there was a diversion opportunity that law enforcement wasn't aware of. Maybe there's something else that we can do. So I didn't want anything to be a surprise. Oh, wow, this case is here. I wanted to be involved in exactly what you said.
Strategies for Youth was founded, almost 15 years ago now, maybe a little bit more. And really the driving force behind it is this sort of large subset of the kids who get arrested, who are arrested for pretty minor things, or what I know Lisa has coined the phrase contempt of cop, where it's the actual interaction between them and police that escalates it to them getting in trouble. Now you're in charge here, but thinking back, does that resonate with you and the cases you saw? Was it, I think she's thrown that number of 40% of cases are like that. Does that resonate with your recollection that a lot of stuff gets there because a kid is impulsive, or they are just very stupid in how they interact with police, and police react to that without a lot of training? I guess that's the sort of thesis for Strategies for Youth, is that better training on both sides improves those interactions.
Yeah, it absolutely resonates, because whatever that interaction, however it started, right? And that really almost doesn't matter. The interaction happens. At Strategies, we want to make sure that the law enforcement officer understands that kids are just developmentally different. So they're bringing something different to that encounter. And I'll use an example. Kids get afraid more so than maybe an adult would be afraid, right? So you walk up to a kid and you ask that person, hey, what's your name? If I don't know why you're asking me that, and I'm 15 years old, maybe I think I'm in trouble. Maybe I think, or maybe I did do something wrong and I don't want you to know my name. And maybe I think you know something, or I don't know why you're asking me that. And all my fear automatically goes up, right? What we try to train law enforcement on is, you just understand that, be aware of that, that if you say to that person, hey, I'm here because you're out past curfew, or I'm speaking to you because that you're going to disarm that situation and make it safer for both the officer and that young person who in that moment is going to just appear differently, right? That's normal. That's normative adolescent development to have that fear. That fear could also result in running, right? I'm not giving you or lying. I'm going to give you a fake name because I don't want you to know my real name, possibly having nothing to do with anything that's happened other than fear in that situation. And I've seen that happen where honestly there was kids walking down the street, officer approaches, hey, what's your name? And the kid lies about their name. That could be a crime or an offense. That could all by itself get a young person in trouble. The officer in that situation, because of a lot of good training, listen, you don't have to, I'm just here because of this. You don't have to lie about your name. And nothing happened. There was no arrest. That's a good result, right? Because that's an understanding of why would somebody do that. Same thing with running. Police cars driving down the street, you have a kid standing there. Maybe they have trauma in their background. Maybe they're something else is going on and they just take off because they don't want to deal. Well, that could look like a fleeing suspect. That could look suspicious. And we try to train law enforcement on understanding that some of these things are just normative adolescent development, as are pushing boundaries, as is a lot of the other things that happen during these encounters. And the better law enforcement is trained in understanding how a youth might be approaching that situation, they can then address it and handle it better. And then, yeah, you mentioned it. We do the same thing with youth. We want to make sure that young people understand and are educated about their rights and obligations. And classic example of that is people are on TikTok, they're on social media. They look at something and they think, you can't talk to me. I'm a juvenile. You're not allowed to talk to me. I've heard that hundreds of times in my career where an officer goes up to a young person, says, hey, I need to talk to you. You can't talk to me. Get out of here. And the next thing you know, that turns into a negative interaction when it's
at odds right away. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. And then all of a sudden it goes from there, right? And we have an interaction that never needed to occur in that way, or an arrest that never needed to occur. And quite honestly, at that point where you have officer safety as well as the safety of that young person when that interaction becomes negative. A story I'll tell you about that is I did, like I said, I did a lot of police training, and we used to ask people all the time, tell us about an interaction that you had with law enforcement. And the story that I tell is this was an older officer who was close to retirement. And he told the story of like when he was 16 years old, he had an interaction with law enforcement that he thought was negative. And it was so impactful to me because here he is now, 40 years later. And I'm like, you still remember that story. You're still telling the story about a negative interaction that you had 40 years ago. So yes, these interactions matter. People remember how you treat them. And that's the important part of this is we know that positive interactions increase pro-social behaviors. They keep your community safer. And that is our goal in training both sides.
So even before you took this job, you've been involved when you were a prosecutor and a county attorney in training law enforcement. What, in your experience, is the sort of secret sauce, if you will, the traits to doing effective training with the police, who are known to be a fairly insular group of people who have a lot of people trying to train them or tell them how to do their job?
Yeah.
So what was effective for you? Because I imagine they see you come and it's, what's this guy know? He sits there in court all day. So how do you get past that and engage?
I think the first thing is understanding that they're being asked to make decisions in a split second, right? It is understanding their role. And I said this to officers throughout my career, that exactly what you just said, John. I have the luxury of sitting at my desk on Monday morning or Tuesday or Wednesday and reading your case file and saying, the perfect response would have been this, or I had the luxury of that time. And they don't often have the luxury of that time. They are in that moment and they have to respond in that moment. And that's why I think training is so important, because to me, it's about policing confidently in the moment. I'm a big sports guy. So to me, it's the same thing. Can you play fast? We ask that of athletes all the time, right? You have to be able to understand the assignment and play fast. And that's always what this training has been to me about for law enforcement is you have to understand all of those things that are going to happen before they happen, right? You have to be aware of how youth might respond, what that might look like. You have to obviously know what diversion opportunities are available or what the solutions might be to those situations. And you have to be able to do that in a split second. So I think the first thing is understanding how quickly they have to make decisions. And then explaining to them, and this is how I've always done it, is this is meant never to criticize the work that you're doing, but to give you tools so that you could do it even better. And I think that is impactful to law enforcement because if they are confident in what they're doing, they're going to make better decisions. It's going to result better. They're not going to be as bothered by the interaction if it's going a different way because they understand where it's coming from. They understand how to control it, how to effectively assert authority, and can handle it better. So I think you have to have credibility. You have to go in there. Why does this matter to them? How does this help them do their job better? Because quite honestly, not having to make an arrest or not have to get into a use of force situation with a young person who is out past curfew is better for them, right? That's the end result of that. The end result of any encounter should never have to be using force unless, of course, something that rises to that level. But again, to me, it's about credibility and it's about understanding their job, understanding what they have to do. And I've always tried to understand it and learn it.
Yeah. We talked about this before, but you're taking over for a founder here, Lisa Thurau, who is also staying on, as my understanding. She's going to be an advisor for you, which is its own interesting dynamic, I'm sure. Did she give you any advice, suggestions as you guys made this transition as to maybe things to do differently than she did or directions to go differently or leadership thoughts in general? Sort of what was imparted to you as you took the torch?
Yeah, well, she's been incredible. She is staying on as a policy advisor. I'm super happy to have her staying on. Like you said, people ask me that all the time because she is a founder and she had her way of doing things. I have to say, she has been phenomenal in talking things through with me because I've had questions for her. Hey, have we tried this? Have we done it this way? Because to me, again, this is every police officer should be trained on youth development. I think, and I know we haven't gotten there, right? And so she and I had some good conversations about that because oftentimes, and I've even seen this, when you say juvenile justice, youth justice, whatever term, the immediate thought of most people is that person as a suspect, right? That's under 18-year-old person who did something wrong. But the reality is kids are everywhere, right? So if an officer responds to the scene of a domestic violence situation, there might be young people in the home who are observing and watching how that police officer is engaging. And there might have to be interaction with that youth, right? Because of whatever the situation is. You pull over a motor vehicle. You might have either a youth as a driver or in the car. And they might be the ones reporting you or saying, you can't talk to me, I'm a juvenile. And they haven't done anything. They're just a passenger in the vehicle. So to me, every officer should be trained in it. So Lisa and I have talked about that quite a bit. This is not just a school resource officer training. This is not just a juvenile officer training. This is really meant and intended for every officer who might, at some point in their call for service, respond to a situation where there's a young person there. And that's all of them. That's not all of them, but that's a lot of them. And I think when we look at it that way, that was one of the first things I said to Lisa is how do we broaden this to not just be looking at SROs or juvenile officers and really get the word out that this is more about any officer who again could be interacting with a young person.
And also crossed my mind as they announced to you that maybe they were organizationally thinking of expanding out to court officers, like prosecutors or attorneys. Is that something that might be on the table or that you guys are doing? Okay.
It is. I'd love to do that because my training, when I took over the juvenile unit, my training was, okay, go figure it out.
Really? No, just dropped into the middle of the fight. Yeah.
I had a supervisor, in fairness. I had a supervisor to the unit, but there was not a lot of intentional, okay, why do we have a youth justice system? Why was it even created? Why does it exist? What does that mean, right? Like, where do you go to understand? How do you learn about developmental normative adolescent development? Where do you go for training? And there was a thing way back, because we're going back 2 decades, as you said, where there was some training here and there, but it just wasn't readily offered. So it was a lot of learning. It was a lot of reading. It was a lot of asking questions, asking people more senior to me. And it's one of the things that I loved about my time as a prosecutor in New Jersey, is me and some of my colleagues who had been there for a while at that point, we created what we called the New Jersey Prosecutors Leadership Network. And it was a group of us who had been there for a while who tried to really take all the young unit chiefs across New Jersey has 21 counties and bring them into the fold and start educating and helping and being there as a resource, because there's a lot of rotation. There's a lot of movement. Traditionally, juvenile court, you go, you do a year, 18 months, 6 months, and then they move you off to the adult section. And so as soon as you're ready, you go to a different section where you could then actually be a prosecutor, so to speak. But you are in juvenile court, and there's so much complexity to this, and there's so many things that you'll see for the first time, and it's about competency and what's appropriate in this situation. What programs do we need? Do we need to develop things, right? Do we need to develop diversion programs? What's happening in your community? Partnerships. And yeah, I was not aware of any of that when I started. It took a while.
Yeah, it feels like there's some things you can do within that paradigm and some that are maybe intractable problems. I just don't. Hit me up at tips@imprintnews.org if you've heard of anybody that succeeded in this. But it kind of seems maybe not a solution that exists to the problem of people don't build their legal careers around staying in the juvenile division. You know what I mean? Like when you think about being a doctor, anesthesiologist is always going to be one of the most popular because it's like that combo of you get paid a lot and it's pretty good on your time as opposed to being in the ER and just living there. Unless you're actually going to come around with making a juvenile court officer position a higher paid one than others in government, I just don't really know what people can do. There's always going to be somebody like you who just takes to it. There will be people that are just like, I think I make a good difference here and I like it.
Absolutely.
You're just like that. Like,
I agree with you. Yeah. I first went to juvenile court in 2000, and then I got rotated out, came back as the supervisor in 2003. And I agree with you. I have spent from 2003 until today talking about how important juvenile court is, how we need to make it a priority, and how it needs to be viewed, just like you said, as a specialty that really requires the time in, because you are, again, that rotational stuff. And I agree with you. It is hard. It is really entrenched, and it's going to take a long time to get to that. But when you take somebody with experience, like I said, to effectively, and I'm going back to my role as Chief Juvenile Attorney, to effectively run a unit like that, you need to have all the community relationships. That includes not just youth serving agencies and organizations, but schools, all of the police departments that exist in your community. You need to be linked to the state in some respect because you need to know what's coming legislatively and other things like that. And you just can't get that in 12 to 18 months. And if you're constantly moving those attorneys, and that's, by the way, not just prosecutors, but that's your defenders, that's your judge.
Oh, sure. Yeah.
Right. So if you're moving those people through and nobody is ever there for long enough to develop those relationships, develop those partnerships, it is really difficult. And that's why we created the network, was for exactly what you said. We knew that there was going to be movement, and the group of us who really took to it wanted to make sure that just because you're in a county where there's movement, we want to be supportive. We want to make sure that you know, like, how to do this, how to do the job. And that's what I'm hoping to build, as you said, is something for those individuals as well. Because I think we call it policing the teen brain. I certainly wouldn't call it prosecuting the teen brain. I think it would need a different name, but there is something to being a court employee in a juvenile court.
Yeah, we'll workshop that name. That could be.
We'll work exactly.
Are you a professional in the field of child welfare, juvenile justice, or other family and youth services? Subscribe today to Youth Services Insider, the imprint's exclusive section on all the insider news you need to stay in the know. Funding opportunities, major federal and state policy shifts, interviews with key leaders in the field. It's all available only for our Youth Services Insider subscribers. Sign up for a monthly or yearly subscription today by visiting imprintnews.org/subscribe. Our podcast listeners get 10% off their subscription by entering the promo code PODCAST10. That's imprintnews.org/subscribe and get 10% off your subscription by entering the promo code PODCAST10 today.
As I was kind of preparing to talk to you, I will say that I completely missed that this happened. It's hard to get stuff by me and the imprint team. We're all over stuff, but you were appointed to this Presidential Commission on Law Enforcement and Justice.
Yeah.
And we're one of the leaders on the juvenile justice division of that during the first Trump administration.
Yeah.
So I think you guys started in 2019. You put out a report I know the report came out in December of 2020, which I felt a little bit better about missing it because I legitimately don't think you could pick a worse month in the history of this country to try and actually get attention to something than dropping it in the middle of that election, COVID. I think Attorney General Barr probably already resigned by the time it came out. So there's like nobody to even talk about it. But I looked through it and it was like an interesting document. I'll tell you what sort of jumped out to me as maybe compelling in there. But but you first, what did you take away from that experience? And I would say I'm particularly interested in your thoughts on what might jump over to this administration when it comes to youth justice policy from what you guys came up with.
Yeah, of course. I was honored to be asked to participate just because I wanted to have a voice at that level. I felt that similar to what we're talking about now, I just want to always put juvenile justice on a pedestal is the word I'll use, but we have to keep talking about it. When I started, we didn't talk a lot about juvenile justice at all. So when I heard we were doing something at the national level, it was like, absolutely, we need to be, I'd love to be involved in this. And so when I was asked, it was no doubt about it. I'd love to be part of it. And the team was fantastic. It was, I was not one of the chairs of that. I was a member of that group. It was chaired by two incredible people who really did a nice job leading us through. You said it. What was so interesting about it is, I forget exactly the time frame, but it had to have been 2019 because we were supposed to begin meeting in person, and then COVID. And then COVID.
Meeting in, and then it was all Zoom. Yeah.
Yeah, and that was the end of it. And everything was done by phone. And by then, like Zoom wasn't even really set up. So these were phone meetings. It was challenging. And then at some point, I think we started using Zoom. And so there were a couple of things that I thought were really impactful that I want to highlight, which I think resonate beyond partisan politics at all. And one is the SRO position and what that needs to look like. And I know that my memory of the report is that we had recommended that if you're going to be an SRO, that you need to, number one, commit to that. You need to commit to that assignment, that chiefs of police need to select the right officers at the right time for the right reasons to become school resource officers. That is one of the most important positions in law enforcement. School policing is different than street policing. It is a completely different assignment. It has different roles. It has a different component to it. And the selection of that officer might be one of the most important decisions a chief of police makes. And we can't take that lightly. And I know that I was one of the gentlemen on the committee was a chief. And we talked about this quite a bit because it's so important to have that stand out because that person is kids are going to see that person every day. And I've seen just in my career, having nothing to do with the national assignment, which is why I thought that was so important. I've seen SROs change the lives of young people in really meaningful ways, quite a bit, quite honestly. And I've seen that relationship and that interaction be so positive and so incredible. And then you could also see it, by the way, if you select the wrong person, you could see that not being positive, right? And I think it's understanding the role. So I really think we need to intentionally, and I think any administration should support this, the SRO position being significant, being something similar to the prosecutor that I just talked about, but an intentional selection of a person who wants to work in the school, who wants to get trained on school policing, who wants to take on that role of advisor, in addition to, of course, managing behavior that's in the school. And when I say behavior, I mean criminal behavior. Obviously, you don't want to be involved in school discipline and things like that. And then that person has to be able to build relationships because you're working with administrators and chief school administrators and teachers and other people, parents. Of course, you need to be an ambassador for your police department. I think number one is the SRO position just being really important.
Let me stop there and ask, because that was really on my list, was I noted the SRO position. I don't want to keep using that. School resource officer. I think everybody knows the police that are stationed in a school, right?
Yeah.
The report definitely operates from the premise they're a good thing, which is, it's more, I think it's more nuanced than that in the broader conversation about youth justice policy. I think there are people that just do not think that we should have them. So it starts from that premise. And like you said, kind of details what makes a good one. And I think that's, you said something interesting there. I think it's like a two-part thing. It's aligning a person to that role. And I'd be interested in your thoughts on what makes a police officer suited for that. And then it's also coalescing around an idea of what the scope of that job is and what it isn't. know?
Yes.
And so from your conversations and that with that commission and just you're plugged in nationally, so you hear from more than just what's going on in Tom's River.
Yes.
Do you think that we've honed in on a more commonly accepted and appropriate role for SROs over all these years? We're going on 3-4 decades now of having them. Are there just less outliers of people that are doing it in a way that a lot of people would be critical of?
So I think there should be, right? I was asked this question not too long ago, and it was exactly what you said. And I do want to go back to that I have certainly seen incidents of school resource officers not enhancing their school community, not being the resource that the job really requires it to be. And I have seen negative encounters and negative experiences with school resource officers. And I think those are unfortunate because those are the ones that always grab headlines. Obviously, those are the ones that people will talk about because they're negative. And we should be talking about them because as an SRO, if we continue to have that position, and I just want to make the distinction here, part of the reason that I support the program is that if you don't have an SRO, you're still likely to get a police response. But now you're going to get a police response from somebody who's just patrolling that area who might not be trained in what it means to be a school resource officer, right? To me, the importance of the SRO position is to not just have patrol who's not trained specifically as a school officer to respond because you're going to get a different response. Like I said earlier, I think school policing is different than street policing. So if you're pulling from patrol, you might get a response that is different than you're going to get with a school officer. But yeah, I think if you're not putting the right person in the role, you're asking for negative interactions. And if you're not challenging that person to be better, asking them what it means to them to be a school police officer, training them. I think every school resource officer needs to be trained. Every state should have it, and they don't. Memorandums of agreement, which define the role of the school resource officer in administration. If we're going to have this program, to your point, if we're going to have it and we're going to decide as a country, society, or municipality that we're going to have it, I think we need to do a better job of defining it. What is it? Who is entitled to have the job? What does that look like? What training are they obligated to get? How often do they have to get that training? What is their role as it relates to school administration? And when those things, and I know we'll talk about the policies a little bit as well, but when you don't have policies like a memorandum of agreement or something that spells that out and that guides those interactions, that's where I think you see those negative interactions. But in the areas where you have the right officer assigned, a chief of police who supports and understands what the role is, an officer who accepts that role, understands that it is there not to make arrests, but to be an asset to the school community, an asset to the kids that are going to that school. I've seen some really great results from it, but it has to be done right. And it goes back to the conversation about prosecutors. And I'm sure you saw this, but I wrote an op-ed earlier the year when I first took over that we need to start prioritizing youth justice. I said I've been talking about this since 2003. I will continue to, because if we don't, that's where you see these negative interactions, because it's somebody who doesn't have the training or the temperament or the experience put into a situation, and that response is predictably what it is, right? And I think we need to be very intentional about that.
Yeah. And I will drop a link for our listeners of that op-ed so you can read it if you want. Yeah. So the SRO piece jumped out. Obviously, the other one to me felt like just a full-on endorsement of what Strategies for Youth does, honestly. And it's just basically verbatim. Both law enforcement agencies and correctional facilities should ensure that employees who will interact with juveniles or be responsible for engaging in the juvenile justice system receive specialized training on the unique aspects of juvenile justice. So I'm sure when Lisa read that, she was doing backflips of happiness. Well, so that came out into the vortex of 2020. Do you feel like the administration now, do you see a lane for this to increase the real attention, frankly, money behind working on exactly what that endorses?
I think there is, because I am a believer that officers want it, that the officers want it. And I think the challenge is to figure out how to get it to the officers in a way that is financially feasible, obviously, but also time-wise feasible. One of the things you had asked about some changes that I'm making, our Policing the Teen Brain is traditionally a 2-day training. I have built out a 1-day curriculum as well, which is really not designed to be the full 2-day. It's meant to whet the appetite and to really look, if you only have one day, let's figure out a way to get this to you, because the officers want it. What I've heard from officers throughout my career, this isn't just in the last few months, but throughout my career, working with young people is one of the hardest things they'll do. And what you hear a lot of is, we just won't engage with young people. Well, that's impossible. That's not realistic, right? In some way, they're going to show up. And in some way, and I've said this quite a bit, it's like anything else. It's exactly, I don't know if you, we'll go back to movies. I don't know if you saw the movie Moneyball, when they asked him, the scene, the first baseman, what are you most afraid of? And he said, the ball getting hit.
Coming in its general direction. Yep. Yep.
And that if we think that way, that's what's going to happen. You're going to show up at a scene, and what do you know? There's going to be a youth there, and you're going to have to engage with them. And I think they want to be trained in this. They really do. I have not gotten negative feedback on training, on why young people are different. Like you said, it's been out there. I've believed in this for decades, trying to make sure that law enforcement understood what they're going to see in those interactions, how they're different, how to best handle them so that you get the best outcome from those interactions, to make sure that they're safe, lawful, all the things that we would want as a community. I think there is a lane. I think the challenge is, like I said, how do you do that? A lot of what we've done in the past is the whole department. So we want to train the whole department. Well, that's a lot. We're asking a lot for a department to say, here's all of our officers at one time. And I know what Lisa's answer to that was, we'll do train the trainers. And then those trainers could impart it to the officers. But that doesn't always happen in practice. You could train trainers, but they then need to find the time to train as well. And if it's going to take 5 years to get through a department, we have some departments with 3,000 officers in them in some of our larger cities in this country. That could be ineffective. So what I want to do is get to every officer, but do it in different ways. So what I'd like to do is go to regions and make it available to them, whether it's a 1-day training, a 2-day training, and basically say, we're offering this course, come out. Because it's a lot easier for a department to send one officer than 20 officers. And if we do that enough, and we can build that out enough, my goal is, like I said, to train every law enforcement officer in this country, because I think it's necessary that they at least have a baseline of why youth are different. What might look like non-compliance might actually not be non-compliance, right? This might just be somebody who is afraid, who's scared, who is engaging with you exactly how development says that they will. And I think we need to understand that on the law enforcement side.
Yeah. I'm curious, though, if you guys have had any interaction with the Federal Office of Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention on this since either during the Biden administration, I guess that would have been before you, or during this Trump administration, because it does strike me as, look, there's some things, especially on the juvenile justice side, right? We cover juvenile justice and child welfare at the Imprint. Federal government is all up in there. Their money is tied to outcomes at the local level. It's a lot of money. The juvenile, it's just not like that. So they don't have a lot of strings. And so there's some things that are just not a good fit for federal funding actually making a difference or being consistent across the way. This does strike me, if you were to say, this is something that we embrace, which they kind of did in this report, as a tenet, actionable and fundable. That said, we have been covering this administration as they've been going through their first year and a half here. There's a lot of action on the child welfare side. They have they have an agenda and they're moving on it. I got to say publicly, it's crickets from the juvenile side, but I don't want to assume that means you guys aren't having conversations or other people don't have access. So what's it been like? Have you engaged, or have they engaged with you on sort of doing this stuff at all?
So we have one grant that's currently open with them.
You do? Okay.
Yeah. Other than that, we have not engaged. We've been working with municipalities. We've been trying to go right to the municipalities to get this into the hands of the officers that need it on more of a local level. Some of that has to do with the fact that I just came on and I'm trying to get our strategy figured out. And because I don't think the federal government is off the table. That's what I would say. I agree with you, right? We met on that years ago. I think it is something that was supported years ago. I think youth justice should be supported. I'm a proponent of it. I think we should support it financially because it's important. And again, getting back to the premise that if we're not trained, that youth are different, then we're going to have predictable outcomes that we might not be happy with. What I say, and I'll say this publicly, I'm happy to have conversations with anybody about anything, because I think it's in this area, of course, because I think this is incredibly important. I don't think it has a partisan angle to it at all. It's about training police officers on how to recognize when is somebody engaging the way that you'd expect them to, and when are they engaging differently? And that's really, to me, what this is about. What can you expect when you engage with teenagers, right? What is that going to look like? And I'll give you, another example that you're familiar with, obviously. Are you going to deal with kids in a group the same as you might alone, right? We've known this forever, that kids act differently in a group than they do when they're on their own. To me, there's just no partisan angle to that. That really is, law enforcement should know that. Law enforcement should know, one of the things that we talk about with youth is that they don't really think through long-term consequences. If I'm a police officer, I want to know that, because that might actually be something that's important to me. When I approach a young person, they might be only thinking in that moment. So how do I interpret their behavior and their actions to make sure that I'm safe, and to make sure that they're safe, and to make sure that we get the best outcome? We also know that kids are incredibly not only resilient, but they do really successful in our diversion programs. And being put deeper into a system isn't always the best outcome. So law enforcement needs to understand that as well. What's one of the cases that I used to handle all the time, you talked about silly cases, was a familial conflict. And I never is probably, I don't like using those words, but I seldom saw a case that was charged as a family conflict that got better by court involvement. We had better results when those cases were handled by specialist youth serving organizations that listened to the family, understood what was going on, realized that maybe some of that behavior was tied to grief or trauma or something else. And I used to ask law enforcement that all the time. What do you think is happening in that court system that we couldn't do someplace else? Again, to me, yeah, I'm willing to have those conversations at the federal level. We've been doing it at the municipal level just because it's because I'm new. I'm trying to speak to the local police chiefs, but I'd love to have that conversation and really expand our reach beyond just the municipal level.
So we've mentioned the model policies, the strategies for youth, come up with a couple times. The last time that we had somebody on from the organization was Shelley Jackson, who's your law enforcement policies attorney, to talk about them. So I don't think we need to go through them again. I'm going to drop a link for anybody that wants to kind of hear about them or read about them. I'll give you a link to where you can read about that on Strategy's website, or listen to Shelley talk to me about it.
Yes.
It's pretty comprehensive about sort of the continuum of things you might expect law enforcement to want to be trained on or get trained on. School resource officers, it's its own thing, is my recollection. Trauma, race, all kinds of things.
Yes.
So my question to you is, that was early 2024 when she joined us, when they came out. What's happened since? Have you guys seen interest from states and counties in adopting it? How do you go about marketing or outreaching on these policies?
That's a great question. So the goal of the policies was to show law enforcement leaders what a model policy could look like, right? That sounds silly, but oftentimes it's what exists, right? It's really hard to ask somebody to, hey, why don't you create 12 policies that you need to do on your own? The response has been positive. The response has been good. We've worked with the Massachusetts Post, who is in the process of actually putting out a juvenile operations standard. Right now, Shelley has spent a lot of time working with the Massachusetts Post, which is the police officer standards and training. In Massachusetts, they certify officers and certify departments. So they've done a lot of work in Massachusetts with the Post. Outside of Massachusetts, we've made them obviously public. One of the things that I would like to do is really, again, go back to why would we create these policies and why are they important to a local department? And it goes to me right back to, are we prioritizing youth justice? Every single police department probably is going to have a policy on use of force. Why? Because that's important. Not every department is going to have a policy on how do we deal with youth. And I think until we start screaming from the rooftop that how we deal with youth is important and it's different, I think we're going to struggle with getting policies adopted by agencies that specifically target youth. It's the understanding that kids are different, that you can't have the same policy for youth that you do for adults. They're just different. And I think it goes back to, and we talked about the years, the juvenile court first was created in 1899 and they're everywhere now. But does everybody know why they were created, right? Why? To me, and I've said this quite a bit, it's the first and best diversion program. Juvenile court was a diversion program from adult criminal court.
Right.
And yet here we are 127 years later, and we're still stumbling around with what's juvenile court. Do we need to have transfer and waive kids to adult court? Do we need to remove them from the juvenile court? For what crimes do we do that for? And oftentimes in those conversations, what you hear people saying, I'd like to be more intentional about it, is what's the purpose of the juvenile court? What was it meant to do? Who was it meant to engage with? And if it was meant to engage with the juveniles, then are we doing that? Right? Why do we have transfer? What's the purpose of transfer? Why do we? And that takes this conversation in a much different direction. But that to me is the purpose of the policies. Until we recognize, I think, in a much greater numbers that we need separate and distinct youth policies, they will not be widely implemented because I think a lot of departments are still operating under, we have policies on use of force and we have policies on Miranda and reading people their rights and we have policies on transport. But do you have youth specific policies? And so my job, I think, over the next, hopefully, couple of years while we're doing this is to convince everybody that you need separate youth policies. And then obviously we've created them. And we don't expect departments to accept them word for word. Obviously, every place is going to be different. We built them to be, and I'm sure Shelley talked about this, to be rewritten or written in a way that your community, obviously, that it works within your community. They're flexible in that way. But again, why develop a policy if you already have a policy and you don't think you need another one? So that I think that's really one of my priorities, is to convince folks that we need separate youth policies, just like we need separate youth training. We need policies that then guide it, because that's the other issue with the training, is that we could train every officer as I want to do across this country. But if we don't have policies that guide those interactions, then the training it's an in the moment type of event. And maybe that next weekend you forget what the training says, or it's not, you remember, but your policy doesn't say anything about that. So I'm going to do it pursuant to department policy. So they're important. I need to make sure that we're talking about them. I need to make sure that we're conversing like this, because I think, again, to me, the holdup is why have youth specific policies in the first place?
Yeah, I think as much effort as you could do to outreach and sell somebody on the idea of having them, probably a good thing that it sounds like Massachusetts can almost be a little bit of a case study for you guys, or a proof of concept if they're pulling in a lot of it. I would hypothesize that over time, the greatest driver of interest to those policies will be, and I mean, be blunt about it, something bad happens in a place, the discussion turns to like, do we need to do something different in the way that we train officers? Right. And then boom, the SEO search returns, oh, there is this place with 12 model policies. We could talk to them. Or stuff, and like, that's sort of just how things happen. I mean, this is not apples to apples. Like we bend over backwards to try to get our stories out to people through social media or newsletters and stuff like that. And it's helpful. But, the biggest driver of content to our site are people looking stuff up and seeing our articles, and I think that's the reactionary inflow that probably will over time.
I agree with you. And we've said that to, like I said, law enforcement leaders, that why wait for that moment? Why do you want to be the one on the news? Get ahead and have the policies. But hey, I agree. And that's the purpose of the training and all of this is to really get folks on the ground to understand how important this is before. Because these interactions are happening, these interactions matter. Even if it doesn't result in a national news story, a negative interaction with the youth, that's a problem, obviously. That turns into somebody who maybe thinks that that law enforcement is not legitimate. They experience something that they determine to be unfair. And then you try to do community policing and you're just not interacting with your community because of incidents that have happened. I really would love to get them, like you said before, but I do agree. And I'm going to take that seriously in terms of really trying to get out there and talk about why does it matter? Because similar to why do we have to have training, I think the question is, why do we need unique policies or different policies?
Yeah. So you guys are in the process, I think, still of building a youth services app for law enforcement, which is interesting to me because everybody's building an app. There's apps for everything. They're as good as the underlying mapping. So we'll see how yours is. But tell listeners about it though. What's the idea behind this? It seem like an interesting approach to encouraging diversion, really, on some level.
It is. It's encouraging information and diversion. I had said it earlier. Every decision that law enforcement makes is based upon what they think their options are, right? So if I am an officer in my community and I think my only two options are arrest or do nothing, then I'm either going to make an arrest or I'm going to do nothing. But if I understand that, wait a minute, just within 5 miles of where I am, There are 3 family programs. There is this trauma program, this grief program, and I know that they exist. I'm more apt to use that, right? I'm actually going to maybe use that. So the first thing the app does is, so you respond to a home and you see that this is a family dynamic. The app allows you to look for what services exist in this area that I could actually make a referral to this family. What the app then does is it allows you to send that to the youth and their guardian, and then they could actually engage with that program again right from the app because they're getting this over text message, and they actually now have that information right there on their phone because it's all done by text message. How we built it out in Indiana is that Indiana also allows you to divert right at that moment. So law enforcement is equipped with the option, again, in Indiana, because that's where the app for the diversion is being used the most. And that then allows the officer to make that diversion referral right there in that moment. What I would like to do with the app, though, is because diversion is great, but that's going to work differently in every state. What I really want it to be is a resource for the officer on the scene to know what programs exist that they can make referrals to right in that area. Because again, I was surprised, and I think some would be surprised that there's just not a lot of connecting there. There's not a lot of training. That was something else that came out from the report that we referenced earlier, the federal report, that you should know what services exist in your community. And I believe the way that was written up is that every community should have like a youth services agency that is actually equipped with how does the money get cycled through the community? What programs do we need? And I envision the app to actually have all of that on it so that law enforcement could pull up the app. Okay, I need grief counseling. Here's an organization that does grief counseling. Bam, I made the referral. And now as law enforcement, I've done my job by connecting that youth with an identified service and a provider.
Yeah. Very cool. What is something, whether it's a resource or a product or a training, that you could see strategies for youth, rolling out a couple of years from now? What's in the pipeline? What are you thinking about doing?
I think right now we do such a good job with law enforcement. And obviously we have the Juvenile Justice Jeopardy that I definitely want to talk about just for a minute. That program is phenomenal. That really does give youth, it empowers youth. It gives them a real understanding of what their rights and obligations are, but it also helps with peer relationships and just understanding decision making. And I'd love to see every kid in the country have that game as well, because, we call it a game, it's a program, but I think every young person should go through that to really understand what really should the interactions look like on their end, right? Is the officer allowed to stop me? Do they have to read me my rights? So I want to really build that out, not just in the school community. I think, again, I don't want to look that narrow at this. I think it's beyond the school community. This can be done, this programming can be done in detention facilities, but it can also be done as anywhere that kids are, because we're giving them information. I think social media, they get a lot of information from social media. Some of that is misinformation. Some of that is just wrong. And I'd really like to give them information. But the new product that I really would like to see us build out is what we talked about earlier, which is training prosecutors and defenders on the uniqueness of this system. Why are you assigned to that unit? Again, there was something that existed 25 years ago now. I'd like to bring that back in terms of what is the meaning and the purpose of the court? Why are you now assigned there? And how does that impact the decisions that we make inside those courtrooms? So I'd really like to be intentional about building that out.
See how it goes. Anthony Pierro, new Executive Director for Strategies for Youth. Thank you so much for joining us on the Imprint Weekly Podcast.
Thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
Thanks to Anthony Pierro, Executive Director of Strategies for Youth, for joining us today. The Imprint Weekly Podcast is a production of the Safe Camp Audio Network, which is a division of Fostering Media Connections. Please visit safecampaudio.org on the web or at Safecamp Audio on all major social media. This podcast is produced and mixed by Christine Anjoko, with music by Luke Giroux and Cyrus Elia. If you enjoyed this episode, we would love it if you would consider subscribing or giving us a 5-star rating on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you download your podcasts. And we would greatly appreciate if you consider supporting our work here on the podcast and in print. Small donations from our listeners and readers go a long way towards helping us grow to cover more great stories in child welfare and youth justice. To support us, it is very easy. Just go to imprintnews.org/donate. You can follow The Imprint on Twitter and Facebook by searching the handle @TheImprintNews, and you can visit us on the web at imprintnews.org or email us at tips@imprintnews.org. I'm John Kelly, and we'll see you next week.